Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I am Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our program titled Making It in Maine, Stories of Jewish Life in Small Town America, with Rabbi Dr. David Freidenreich. Over the past few years, we have journeyed around the United States and world, exploring different Jewish communities. Some of those communities have included Texas, Wisconsin, and Poland. And in case you missed them, these lectures are all on our website. Tonight, we will discover the unique history of Jewish Maine. Whenever I've mentioned this topic over the past several months, many have said they know someone from Maine. I was somewhat surprised by this common response, and I look forward to exploring this community with you all. Thank you to Judy Mazo for sponsoring this program in memory of the grandfather of her good friend, Judy Peller Hallett. Her grandfather, Benjamin S. Stern, was a member of Maine's legislature and is in the Maine Jewish Hall of Fame. Thank you, Judy. My usual logistical note before introducing the speaker: if you have any questions during the presentation, please click on the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Questions will be discussed at the end of the lecture. I now would like to welcome Rabbi Dr. David M. Freidenreich, the Pulver Family Professor of Jewish Studies at Colby College, where he serves as the chair of the Jewish Studies Department and the Associate Director of the Center for Small Town Jewish Life. He directs Colby's Maine Jewish History Project, whose website features dozens of essays on the state's Jewish history, including several that he wrote. David's primary research outside of the history of Jewish Maine focuses on the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic attitudes toward one another. He is the author of Foreigners and Their Food, Constructing Otherness in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Law, and most recently, Jewish Muslims, How Christians Imagined Islam as the Enemy. He teaches a wide range of courses on Judaism and Jewish history, civic leadership, and comparative religion. After receiving a BA from Brandeis University, he earned a PhD at Columbia University and his rabbinic ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And with that, Professor Freidenreich, the screen is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me make sure that the screen sharing is working properly. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Excellent. So good evening or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. Thank you for making the time to explore some stories of Jewish life in Maine. And I'm going to make the case in small town America more broadly. I'll begin with a story that Robert Haynes told about growing up in Waterville, Maine, where his grandfather served as the rabbi. This story took place sometime during the 1940s. Maybe until my grandmother passed away, for the most part, we kept kosher. Although I remember lobster on the house on occasion. It may have been on paper plates. Then we had company. Some of my mother's family was visiting and wanted lobsters. And the phone rang, and my grandparents would be there in 5 minutes so they could visit our company. It all got packed up and out, and the windows open and the smell gone in the 5 minutes before they got there. This is a distinctly Maine variation on a classic story of American Jewish life. It captures dynamics of Americanization, as well as the generational differences caused by those dynamics. It also reflects efforts to balance tradition and change. Robert Haynes's parents served lobster at home, despite the fact that it isn't kosher, but they made a point of using paper plates rather than their kosher dishes. Stories of Jewish life in Maine like this one are about what it means to be from Maine. That's why the Maine State Museum mounted an entire exhibition on the subject just a few years ago. These stories are also about what it means to be Jewish in America. In some cases, the stories could have taken place anywhere. Often, they're stories about Jewishness in small town America, which is to say outside of the major metropolitan areas. This map is how we tend to see the landscape of American Jews. A real emphasis on specific states, and even more so, specific cities. I suspect that many of you could probably guess which are the top 7 Jewish metropolitan areas, and those 7 metros alone contain more than half of this country's Jewish population. When you expand out to the top 40, you get 80% of the Jewish population, and this isn't new. In the 1920s, upwards of 90% of Jews lived in major metros. The thing is, there have always been a significant number of Jews in small, rural, and remote areas. If you look at this map with an eye toward the blank spaces, with an eye toward the percentages that aren't represented, you discover that there are 1 million Jews today who live in counties with fewer than 10,000 Jews. Some of those million American Jews, perhaps 20,000 or so, live in Maine. Which begs the question, why move to small towns? The answer is the same as why you might move to a major metro: quality of life, including job opportunities. 1850 in Bangor. Bangor was the world's largest lumber port. There was a tremendous economy going, and people needed clothing. Jews were very active in both the clothing manufacturing and also in clothing sales. They worked as dry goods merchants across the country, and a handful of them realized that there was a market to be served in Bangor, Maine. The thing is, in 1850, 99.5% of people who lived in Maine were either native-born Americans or immigrants from Britain and its colonies. As native speakers of German, let alone as Jews, the Jews who settled in places like Bangor in the 19th century were part of a tiny minority. And so what did they do? They banded together to create a support network, to care for one another. And that support network in Bangor, beginning in 1849, took the form of a congregation known as Ahavas Achim, or brotherly love. And that name captures what it is that these Jews were looking for from one another. And the minute book, which you see a picture of on the screen, captures their priorities. The very first thing that Ahavas Achim did was purchase a plot of land for a cemetery. And one of the benefits that they offered to members was to cover full burial costs. Not only that, synagogue trustees were required to visit ill members of the community, and all members were required to attend funerals. Attendance policies were backed up by fines. This was a community that recognized that they had to struggle with the basic necessities of life, which is to say, death. And they wanted to do it in community with one another, with support from people who were like them, who cared about them. Not only were they worried about basic necessities of life, such as death, they were also worried about food. The cantor who was employed by Ahavas Achim doubled as the town's kosher butcher. These kind of support networks sprang up across the country, not only in the form of synagogues, but also in the form of B'nai B'rith organizations. In fact, in Portland, Maine, the very first Jewish organization to be founded, 1874, was not a synagogue, but rather a chapter of B'nai B'rith. And about half of the members of Portland's B'nai B'rith chapter came from other parts of the state of Maine, some of them as far as, by today's driving standards, 5 hours away. In the 1870s, I don't think those members ever attended a lodge event in Portland, but they were in it for the sense of connection. They were in it for the life insurance benefits. They were in it because Jews were on the move and they wanted to stay connected with one another. And in fact, because Jews were on the move, Ahavas Achim disbanded in 1856. The local economy suffered a downturn, and the Jews decided that they could pursue their goals better in other parts of the country. Some of them moved to major metros like Baltimore or Chicago or New York. Others moved to small towns, including in the South and the far West. While they were together, they supported one another, and they did what they needed to do to meet their own goals. Many of the Jews who settled in Bangor, whether in that first community of the 1840s and 50s, or when the community was reestablished, first in the 1870s, and then again further in the 1880s, 90s, into the early 1900s, came to town as peddlers. Historian Hasia Diner offers a vivid depiction of the prototypical Jewish peddler, and this story captures what it was like to be a peddler really anywhere around the world. He knocked, introduced himself to almost always a woman who opened the door. He asked her to look in his bag or box or pack. He had to figure out how to ingratiate himself to her, as every sale mattered. And to do so, he had to guess what she might want, what message to deploy in talking with her, and how best to charm her into buying this or that. In this little drama played out on multiple continents in multiple languages, he proffered a range of goods which represented a new, higher, and actually better standard of living. He didn't carry food or fuel, life's basic necessities. Rather, from the depths of his pack, he brought out for display sheets and pillowcases, pictures and picture frames, clothing and cloth, needles, threads, buttons, lace, bedspreads and tablecloths, eyeglasses, suspenders. The list went on and on as this paradigmatic peddler moved up the ladder and managed to acquire a horse and wagon. Then the goods got bigger and heavier, stoves and bathtubs, still representing a cosmopolitan standard of consumption associated with cities, modernity, and the lifestyles of the better off classes. The Jewish immigrant peddler educated the farmers, miners, loggers, plantation laborers, mill workers, and working class families to crave these finer things in life, goods associated with their social betters. The peddlers brought these goods within reach of the more humble women whose homes they entered. Peddlers, in other words, served the lower classes. And for that reason, to say nothing of the fact that they themselves were lower class and immigrant, often drew the resentment of the upper classes. Here is a story from Maine, written by Rena Ledbetter McElroy, recounting a scene in front of a fancy hotel in the town of Wayne in 1887. Oh, look, there's Meyer Sharafiski, the little pack peddler. He won't call here. The Howards, proprietors of the hotel, would object. Their guests are hardly the type to patronize him. He's Russian, very polite and speaks English well, considering the time he's been in the country. How the children are crowding around. Just a few pennies will buy trinkets. He often gives to those who haven't any. A few years later, Meyer drove through town in a shiny new vehicle filled with merchandise, a boon to busy stay-at-home housewives. A few years later still, the Sheriff brothers were doing a thriving business in a shiny store in Livermore Falls. Now, instead of Meyer going to the people, they came to him, remembering his courtesy and kindness of earlier years. The profit in peddling was good, but life on the road was often lonely and miserable. Peddlers transitioned to shopkeeping as soon as they saved up enough money. This also enabled them to settle down and get married. In many cases, those Jewish shopkeepers then partnered with fellow Jews to peddle their wares in the countryside. After all, the roads were so bad that very few people came into town if they didn't already live there. And so you have a phenomenon of chain migration, where Jews support fellow Jews, often from the same town or region in the old country, to get themselves established in a particular place in the new country, in America, in Maine. But wait a minute, why come to Maine in the first place? Here's how Sussman Russakoff recounted his decision in 1907. Here I was, about to become a father. I must do something for my wife and child, but have only $350. What can I do with so little? How can I set up a business with so small a sum? I want to establish my family in a decent home. Do I have to remain a worker at the bench, depending on my week's pay? If I don't venture now when I'm young and have a little money put by, when will I be able to take such a step? My boss in New York City tried in every way to make me change my mind about Maine. It was a backward state, not progressive, had few Jews and so on, but I paid no attention. When I arrived, the air was beautifully clear and frosty. The snow was as white as snow could ever be, and as one walked on it, it responded with a crispy, clear singing. Its song was one of welcome to me. I was sick of the East Side, tired of running for the L, the ferry, and crosstown cars, weary of the pushing and jumping into the music of the alley cats. Here, there was serenity and peace. Sussman Russakoff put a deposit down on a small shop with a second-floor apartment, and 115 years later, Russakoff Jewelers is still there on the main street of Skowhegan, Maine. Hiram Adelman, according to his son Milt, arrived in New York, talking about the late 1800s, and spent a year working in a hardware store. But he didn't like it because he wasn't used to city life. And he asked everybody where he could go where it was more similar climate to where he came from. And they told him to go as far north as he could go, to Maine. So he took his savings and got on the train and went to Houlton, Maine, which was as far as the train went at the time. Houlton, for those of you who are not familiar with Maine geography, is on the border with Canada. Milt Edelman pedaled from Houlton all the way up to Presque Isle, opened a department store in the small town of Mars Hill in 1903, and eventually found himself in the quintessential business of Aroostook County, Maine, namely potato farming. Although Milt Edelman was more of a potato broker than a farmer himself, he had connections in business and was able to help local farmers, himself included, sell their wares to customers across the Northeast. There's a pattern going on here. Jews who moved to Maine tended to come from northern parts of Europe. The very first Jewish Mainer about whom we know anything, Sussman Abrams, arrived from Hamburg shortly after the Revolutionary War. He worked as a tanner and a cooper in the town of Union. Bangor's early community hailed from Posen in German Poland. Sussman Russakoff came from White Russia, the border today between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Waterville's founding chain migration family, the Levines, came from Lithuania. William Levine, according to the family, came to Waterville in 1889, simply because Maine's peddler's license cost half as much as the license in Massachusetts. He probably got his start selling goods for local Jewish merchants, some of whom had been in town as early as the 1850s. William rented a storefront soon after. His wife helped manage the store while he was still out doing peddling, but then he settled down, and not only did he manage the store, but he kept on inviting friends and family to join him in Waterville. By 1920, 40% of Waterville's Jewish households were related to William Levine. The thing is, there was actually a lot of turnover going on in not only Waterville's Jewish community at the time, but all of Maine's Jewish communities, and I suspect small town communities across the country. Those individuals who were successful as shopkeepers or perhaps as junk dealers stayed in town. Those who were less successful moved elsewhere to try their fortunes in another community. In Waterville, there was a 50% turnover in the Jewish population decade over decade during the first half of the 20th century. Levine's store became one of the most successful businesses in town during the 20th century, known as the largest local retailer of Levi's jeans, and home to what was affectionately known as the Colby Corner, where William's sons, Ludi and Pacey, who are in the back of that picture, accompanied by one of their cousins who helped them run the store, made sure to outfit every Colby College student who came to town, because they themselves, Ludi and Pacey, in fact, Howard as well, were very proud alumni of Colby College. This brings me to the next theme that I want to explore, namely Jews in education. The early 1920s in the United States witnessed a rise in effective public education and an increased economic value of higher education. Jews were especially likely to seize these new opportunities. They were more likely to complete high school than others in the same communities, and they were far more likely to attend college. And the question is why? This is a problem that historians have struggled with for quite some time, and some of the data from Maine reveals patterns that may well explain dynamics across the country. One factor that accounts for why Jews were so likely to complete high school, and even then to go on for higher education, is that they had greater access than many of their non-Jewish neighbors. In Maine, Jewish immigrants had a higher socioeconomic score by standard sociological methods of calculation than did either native-born Mainers or the largest immigrant community in the state, Franco-Americans, which is to say French speakers who moved down from Quebec. Not only were Jews better off economically because Jewish fathers worked in stores, aided heavily by Jewish mothers, Jewish kids could help out in the store, support the family business after school hours. Francos, in contrast, tended to work in the local mills. Both parents were often in the factories, and if the kids needed to help out to earn some extra income, they had to work in the factories too. And the factories employed kids 8 hours a day, at least 6 days a week. You couldn't stay in school and hold a factory job at the same time. And so in many cases, Franco kids dropped out of school. In many cases, those who were native to Maine dropped out of school. Jews were often able to continue their education, at least through high school, and for those who wanted, even beyond. Access alone, however, doesn't account for the full story. Even when you control for other factors, comparing, for example, merchants in the same town, Jews were 14% more likely than non-Jews to attend college. And I'm grateful to my student, Jake Nash, for calculating some of these figures as part of an economics senior thesis. He worked not only with statewide data, but also with data from Lewiston High School, whose yearbook conveniently listed exactly what everybody planned to do the year after they graduated. Controlling for the father's occupation or property value, Jewish graduates of Lewiston High were 3 times more likely to pursue higher ed than their non-Jewish classmates. And even among those who pursued higher ed, Jews were more likely to opt for a 4-year liberal arts education rather than, say, training at a secretarial school or other technical program. Interestingly enough, in Bangor, a quarter of Lewiston High School's graduates attended Bates College, where they were able to gain any range of training for a variety of skills. Why is it that Jews had such great interest in higher education? Many people have said it's because Jews are people of the book. I don't buy it. And one of the reasons I don't buy it is that the Jews who were in Maine were not especially Talmudically inclined. They were not especially interested in traditional forms of education. They were interested in making sure that their kids had the resources to succeed. Jews may have been people of the book, but more fundamentally, Jews in Maine were people on the move. As Amos Oz puts it, describing the Jewish experience internationally, it was always like that with Jewish families. They believed that education was an investment for the future, the only thing that no one can ever take away from your children, even if, heaven forbid, there's another war, another migration. Just as Jews moved in and out of Maine to find better opportunities, they pursued education for themselves and for their kids to facilitate that kind of mobility. There's another interesting dynamic when it comes to the sheer number of Jews from Lewiston who attended Bates College. Bates, like Bowdoin and many other colleges and universities of the 1920s and 30s, had a restrictive admissions policy. At Bates, there was a strict 3% quota for Jews. Bowdoin conveniently kept its Jewish population to precisely 13 people at any one given time, even as total enrollment ballooned from 400 to 550. And those restrictions affected Jews from Boston, but not Jews from Lewiston, Maine, or Brunswick, Maine, home to Bowdoin College. These colleges, Bates explicitly, were committed to serving the local community. And so within that restrictive admissions policy that they had for Jews, they prioritized local Jews. Bates graduates who I interviewed who grew up in Lewiston had no idea that there was a quota because everybody they knew got in. The stories that I heard from folks who grew up in Boston was, don't bother applying to Bates, they won't let you in. Apply to Colby College instead. Colby admitted Jews begrudgingly. It needed the enrollment. But the dean of men would not allow those Jews to form a fraternity. The first effort to establish a Jewish fraternity took place in 1919. The fraternity, Tau Delta Phi, was not established until 1932. Restrictive admissions into fraternities began after World War I, and they tremendously affected the lived experience of Jewish college students. Remember that in the era before college dining halls, fraternities were where you got your food. In many cases, fraternities were where you found your lodging. Jews had to count on members of the local Jewish community to provide room and board. Even when Colby moved to a new campus in the 1940s and 50s and had a nominally non-sectarian, but everybody knew it was the Jewish fraternity Tau Delta Phi, its frat house was set off of fraternity row, not alongside the rest of the fraternities. Not only did fraternity life shape food and lodging, it also shaped dances and social life. I heard an anecdote just a couple of weeks ago from a Jewish woman who attended Colby in the early 1950s. She transferred after 1 year because she was sick and tired of having all of her meals alone. Although Colby had a fraternity that accepted Jews, in fact, that same fraternity was the first to accept African Americans and Asian Americans, it never had a Jewish sorority, and Jewish women were left out and very much felt excluded. This dynamic of exclusion was not particular to college campuses. It was part of the broader society in Maine and throughout the country during the 1920s and 30s. The Ku Klux Klan had a very strong presence in the state of Maine. In Maine, their focus was not Blacks. There weren't very many. There were some. Primarily, the Klan was known for its anti-Catholic discrimination, secondarily, anti-Semitic discrimination. The Klan in Maine was powerful. Maine's governor was a member of the Klan. The Klan was prominent within the city of Portland, then and now the largest. During the 1920s, Portland's elders, and in fact a majority of its voters, amended the city charter in a way that was explicitly designed to disenfranchise immigrant communities in the downtown. Not only did this happen at the level of government representation, it also happened at the level of housing. The inset map here is not from Maine. It's from my hometown of Philadelphia. This is what an original version of a red line map might have looked like. The map from Portland is a rather poor photocopy. What you can see in the map of Philadelphia is that local banks and real estate agents color-coded the entire city, defining neighborhoods as desirable, borderline. Red was hazardous. Those of you who know Philadelphia will recognize the lasting impact of these maps. Those neighborhoods that were identified as hazardous in the 1930s may or may not have been at the time, but they certainly were some of the more hazardous neighborhoods by the time I was growing up there in the 1990s, and to a significant degree, continue to impact the civic space of Philadelphia to this day. What's striking about Portland's red line map is that the creators were quite explicit about the neighborhoods they defined as hazardous. Why were they hazardous? Because they were home to the Poles, to the Italians, to the Irish, and to the Jews. Ethnicity determined whether a neighborhood was suitable for financial investment. And if you lived in a red-lined neighborhood, you couldn't get a mortgage. You couldn't get a home improvement loan. And so those houses became less and less desirable over time. Because Jews were upwardly mobile, they found ways to move out of red-lined neighborhoods, but they still couldn't move into certain exclusive communities in and around Portland. Restrictive covenants prevented Jews from moving to certain areas into the 1970s. The same is true for one of Maine's most famous attractions and economic activities, namely Maine as vacation land. The thing is, Maine touted itself as vacation land for certain kinds of vacationers. You've probably heard of Poland Springs. They were originally known not for the bottled water, but rather as one of the most exclusive resorts in the state. One way in which they demonstrated their exclusivity was by not allowing Jews to stay at their resort. Jews stayed instead at the Summit Springs Resort, just a couple of hills away. This practice continued well into the 1950s and beyond, when the ADL defined Maine as the most discriminatory in terms of hotel accommodations in the entire country. Julie Miller Soros, born in the early 1950s, recalls, as a little girl, when we went to Bar Harbor or Kennebunkport, there were signs. This is really disgusting. I'm sorry that we're on tape, but there were signs that said, no dogs, no niggers, no Jews allowed. I do also remember my senior year of high school. In fact, it may have been my junior year of high school. That summer, many of my non-Jewish friends were going to get summer jobs in Bar Harbor. It had changed by then, I thought. The signs weren't there, at least. My blonde, blue-eyed friends that would fit in beautifully in Wilton, Connecticut, were going to get jobs in Bar Harbor. Whether they were chambermaids, waitresses, whatever, they wanted to be at the coast for the summer. I remember telling my mom, though, I'm going with Robin. We're going to Bar Harbor, and we're going to find a place to live. We're going to get a waitress job or a busgirl job or whatever for the summer. It'll be really fun. And she looked at me and said, and I'll never forget this because I thought she was nuts. She looked at me and said, Robin will get a job. Nancy will get a job. Sherry will get a job. You will not get a job. I was like, what are you talking about? And she says, they won't ask you if you're Jewish, but you will not get a job. And I thought, she's crazy. That doesn't happen. She was 100% right. All three of my friends got jobs, and I did not. That was the summer of 1970. It's no surprise that Jews spent their summers where they felt welcome and comfortable. Maine was home to dozens of Jewish summer camps, catering primarily to out-of-state Jews. Of course, Maine was home to hundreds of other summer camps as well, but Jews gravitated to Jewish camps even when those camps had no explicit Jewish content, because they felt safe and comfortable and accepted with fellow Jews. Old Orchard Beach, just a few miles north of Kennebunkport, was a place where Jews from Massachusetts to Quebec came and summered together. Not just Jews, but Catholics as well. Why? Because Old Orchard Beach was kind of the low class enough that it was going to be open and welcoming and accepting to anybody, regardless of socioeconomics, ethnicity, or religion. Old Orchard Beach was a great place to meet a spouse. In fact, May Cohen of Bangor, top left of that picture, found her husband in Old Orchard after having spent several summers there. Not all Jews married fellow Jews, however, and this is especially true in small communities. I'm going to share the remarks of Toby Shafter describing the Jewish community of Rockland, Maine in the 1940s. I want you to notice the gendered language, some of the stereotypes and derogatory terms that are being used here. This is all typical of a certain time, place, and perspective. Nearly every old Jewish family with children of marriageable age has been affected in one way or another by intermarriage. Note, this is the 1940s we're talking about. Let me go on. Although there is always much sadness on the part of the immediate family and much sympathetic clucking of tongues from friends, the announcement that a young man is about to marry or has already secretly married a shiksa hardly creates a sensation by now. The few Jewish girls who have married Gentile men have, on the other hand, been subject to vehement criticism, coffee hour gossip, and unending speculation. In all cases except one, they have not remained in town. The one girl who did marry a native state of Maine is completely divorced from the Jewish community. On the other hand, the Jewish men who marry outside the fold retain some semblance of attachment to the Jewish community. They generally attend the high holiday services and send their children to the synagogue for Sunday school lessons, even though they and their wives do not mingle socially with the Jewish crowd. There is a certain restraint in the comment of Jewish families on the subject of intermarriage. You can never tell when it'll happen to you, they explain sadly, placing it in much the same category as color. These attitudes regarding mixed marriage had a significant impact on the children. William Cohen was Maine's most famous child of intermarriage. He trained for his bar mitzvah in Bangor, Maine, but he refused to convert. He considered himself Jewish as well as Irish Catholic. And when the synagogue refused to let him be bar mitzvahed without conversion, he simply walked away. Remained connected to the Jewish community in various ways over the years, but could not find a home within that community. One thing that William Cohen did find a home for was success in the world of politics. Went on to become a senator from Maine, Secretary of Defense. And in these respects, frankly, like his fellow Maine Senator George Mitchell, Lebanese immigrant, William Cohen was a role model for the Americanization of the children of immigrants. Americanization was a primary goal of Jewish Mainers throughout the 20th century, arguably beginning in the 19th century. Jews like Dave Astor, who was the host of a local American Grandstand-style TV show, promoted American culture, American values. Jews like Beth Hilson of Old Town embraced Americanization. She grew up in the 1950s and recounted her experience as follows. Sometimes I feel like Grandma Sophie and Grandpa Benny are still living in that other world. I separate myself from their traditions, their foods, their thick accents that come from deep in the throat and pepper every sentence. I'm not like them. I have a collection of single records like Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog and Hot Diggity, and I wear a wide felt skirt with a black and pink poodle on it. I do not speak Yiddish when I want to keep secrets. I don't even understand it. I do not eat bagels slathered with cream cheese and draped in slices of pink smoked salmon. I do not savor the kishka Grandma makes, cow intestine stuffed with schmaltz and breadcrumbs, the stuff that causes my father to grunt with pleasure when he bites into one of those sausage-like delicacies. I am not that kind of Jew. I am part of the Wonder Bread generation. I am processed and homogenized, just like all the other kids in the 3rd grade. Americanization wasn't just a post-war phenomenon, and it wasn't just about the decisions of individuals. Portland's Jewish Community Center, in a 1938 policy statement, declared that one of its primary goals was, quote, to provide and foster a sound and basic understanding of American democracy, to promote good citizenship, to participate in civic activities, and to establish a neighborly attitude in our community. This American spirit motivated Jews to serve in large numbers during both world wars and to honor and memorialize those who served. A scandal broke out in Waterville, Maine in 1973, when the rabbi, asked by the local newspaper for a reaction to the Yom Kippur War, declared, "We are Jews first and Americans second." As Sam Shapiro recalls, it was one of the first times the synagogue moved at a fast pace. At 8 o'clock that morning, we had a board meeting and he was gone because most of the board members were former veterans themselves, and we are certainly not Jews first and Americans second. Sam Shapiro also features in another story recounted by Waterville's current rabbi, Rachel Isaacs. According to synagogue legend, the first woman to receive an aliyah at Beth Israel congregation was Mert Wollman, simply because there weren't enough men to say the 7 blessings during the Torah service. At one Shabbat in the 1980s, Sam Shapiro, a man few would describe as Maine's most prominent feminist, but a Jew with a strong sense of justice and equality who confronts realities for what they are, roughly approached Mert and said, "You've got the next one." And that is how Beth Israel became an egalitarian congregation. Liberal forms of Judaism came very late to Maine. Until World War II, all but one synagogue was Orthodox. Today, in contrast, the only active Orthodox communities are those cultivated by Chabad. Of the non-Orthodox synagogues in the state, half, including Beth Israel and Waterville, are led by women rabbis. And until recently, a third of the state's congregational rabbis identified as gay, lesbian, or trans. Maine has become one of the more progressive Jewish communities in the United States. Let's be very clear, Maine is a purple state, not a blue state, and that applies within the Jewish community as well as beyond. But Maine is open and welcoming to a wide range of Jews. Not only that, Maine ranks among the least religious states in the country. And so it's no surprise that Jews in Maine often emphasize cultural aspects of their identity rather than religious ones. What may seem surprising from the outside is the substantial participation of non-Jews in the state's Jewish life. Part of this is a reflection of non-Jews who are married to Jews and participating in the Jewish community in that context. Intermarriage is now quite commonplace throughout the state. But it's not just that. There are a significant number of non-Jews with no Jewish family members who enroll their kids in Jewish preschools, a Jewish day school, elementary and middle school, in Jewish summer camps. Before the pandemic, half of the audience members at the Maine Jewish Film Festival didn't self-identify as Jewish. What we see here is that Maine's Jewish organizations continue to offer something of value, and that what Jews in Maine are looking for tends to be the same kind of thing as what non-Jews in Maine are looking for. These communities have become increasingly similar over the years, and for that reason, mutually reinforcing. As I begin to wrap up my formal remarks, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions and answers that will follow, I'd like to pivot to dynamics of Jewish life in Maine today that are reflective of small communities across the country. First and foremost, diversity. Many people think about places like Maine as tremendously white, and they are. Maine is the whitest state in the Union. But not only are Jews in Maine majority intermarried, the Jewish community is heavily multiracial and multi-ethnic. The photo you see here is of a kosher Caracas fundraiser catered by Venezuelan members of the Jewish community, aided by a handful of Jewish Puerto Ricans. In addition, in small towns, Jews are unable to self-sort politically or culturally. Those of you who live in major metropolitan areas probably know which synagogues tend to be more progressive, which synagogues tend to be more supportive of conservative political leanings. In places like Maine, everybody's got to find some way to function as a single community, notwithstanding all of the tensions that are tearing at the fabric of American society. Not only is small-town Jewish life characterized by diversity, it's also characterized by class tensions, and more fundamentally by class dynamics. Poverty in particular is a lived reality in the general community in most of the state of Maine, and that includes many Jewish members of the community. Nearly every child in the city of Waterville qualifies for free and reduced lunch, and everybody in town feels the effects of that. More fundamentally, class is not just about money. It's also about the culture that comes with wealth. And kids who grow up in a community without much wealth struggle to interact socially with kids who come from more affluent parts of the country. What you see in this photo is a Jewish summer camp run by the Center for Small Town Jewish Life that runs on a tuition of $5 a day. Why? Because many of the families can't afford to pay more than $5 a day, but are too proud to ask for scholarships. Not only that, even if they got scholarships to one of the many camps in Maine that cater to the Jewish community, their kids would have a really hard time fitting in with bunkmates who grew up in a very different cultural and social world. Another important aspect of small-town Jewish life is the culture of participation. It is an all-hands-on-deck community because there simply aren't enough hands around. As a result, you have multi-generational leadership. Younger members of the community, including, at least in Waterville, Maine, college students, play an active role in the community because they know that they're needed. In Waterville, the culture is for the Hillel presidents to deliver one of the Yom Kippur appeals. And the appeal is to their fellow students to become members of the synagogue. As a result, the kids who grow up in the synagogue look to college students as their role models. And it is no coincidence that 3 Boston area Hillels today are being led by college students who grew up in the small town of Waterville, Maine. The downside of this culture of participation is the increased potential for burnout. There's simply a very shallow pool of potential leaders, which makes it very challenging for those in leadership to pass the baton when they've had enough. this is where the Center for Small Town Jewish Life comes into the picture. The center cultivates vibrant, socially equitable Jewish communities. We offer a range of programs in the state of Maine. I mentioned our $5 a day summer camp. You can see here the poster for our Maine Conference for Jewish Life, which annually attracts between 200 and 400 members of the community for a weekend of learning and celebration. We offer training programs to enable lay leaders in local communities to learn how to lead Shiva Minyans, how to keep the synagogue running when their rabbis are on vacation. We also offer a range of leadership training programs for college students and for rabbinical students who are interested in learning how small town Jewish life differs from what they've experienced in major metros. One of the things that we emphasize at the Center for Small Town Jewish Life is Jewishness rooted in a strong sense of place. People move to Maine because they value what it means to be from Maine. So Jewish life in Maine should reflect what it means to be from Maine, which is not the same as what it means to be from New Hampshire, let alone from New Mexico. What we do on the national front then is train leaders and share knowledge to enable folks who serve and participate in Jewish communities in New Hampshire, New Mexico, you name it, to apply the skills, models, systems that we've created here in Maine in their own communities, adapting to the particularities of their cultural, economic, and social circumstances. Why do we do it? Because we believe that everyone should have dignified access to inspirational learning and thriving Jewish life, no matter where they live or how much they earn. There are 1 million American Jews right now who are being underserved, and we are doing everything we can to help empower those individuals and their communities and to help raise awareness of the needs that often get overlooked within the American Jewish landscape. If you're interested in learning more about the Center for Small Town Jewish Life, you can check out jewishlife.colby.edu. About Maine Jewish history, I recommend the Maine Jewish History Project website, web.colby.edu/Jews in Maine. You will find there a wide range of articles, essays, photos, exhibits, including much of the material that I use to prepare these remarks. I've also posted my own personal website and email address. Happy to continue the conversation after we're done this evening, but especially interested in having a conversation right now. Thank you all for being here, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Professor Freidenreich, for sharing such fascinating narratives about the Jewish community in Maine, and the work that you're doing with the Center for Small Town Jewish Life truly sounds amazing. And as the questions begin to come in, I'm wondering, I heard much passion in your voice just now speaking about the center. I wonder if you want to say a little more about what led you to study the Jews of Maine and the sort of the work that you're doing now.
Had anybody told me 20 years ago that I'd be giving a lecture of this nature, I would have laughed. In fact, I nearly ditched my job interview at Colby because I was worried about Jewish life in Maine. I grew up in suburban Philadelphia. I went to Brandeis and then to graduate school in New York City. My wife and I always imagined moving back to New England, by which we really meant the Boston area, because we couldn't imagine small town Jewish life. And what I've discovered since moving here, both through collecting stories about Jewish life in Maine and through experiencing the warmth and welcoming and inclusive nature of the community, and also now through watching Jewish life through the lens of my own children's experiences, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. This is such a wonderful place to live. It's a wonderful place to live Jewishly. And there are so many benefits that come from Jewish life in places like Maine that my relatives who still live in the New York and Philadelphia areas just don't have. And I recognize there are plenty of great things about those communities as well. But this is where I want my home to be.
Thank you. That's really wonderful. I have a few questions here that maybe relate to how you feel. Maybe I don't know how others feel in your community, but there's just quite a couple of questions about the population in these towns, whether they're increasing and decreasing, and you know, just what the immigration to Maine looks like today.
Sure. So population has always fluctuated. The tendency is that children will move out of the state, although increasingly we're finding that Maine is attractive enough that people are moving back. There has always been an influx of Jews from out of state into Maine. It comes in waves. After 9/11, there was a large influx. The 2008 financial crisis sent more Jews into Maine. The pandemic sent a huge number of Jews into Maine. Once people began being able to work remotely, they were able to prioritize quality of life over proximity to certain kinds of workplaces. Not only that, Maine is an attractive destination for retirees. And so there have been quite a few Jews who have been moving into the community in recent years. Nobody has really firm numbers on any of this. It's all kind of anecdotal. But right now, I would say that there are about 20,000 Jews in the state. That would be an increase from 10 years ago.
Nice. Yeah, I imagine during these times it'd be nice for people to get out of some of those big cities and head to Maine. I mean, I get following up on that question, I guess, you know, in the virtual world we live in, that you can kind of change your answer, but are there occupations that the Jews are concentrated in, or in the community today, or, you know, and historically? I mean, or I guess in the past few decades.
Historically, Jews were concentrated in commercial fields. So Jews were Main Street merchants. Jews were often in the junk business. Those were the kinds of fields that were attractive. Jews, frankly, who wanted to be working in factories could stay in New York, could move to Chicago, places like that. What tended to happen is that as Jews pursued higher education, they moved into the professions. During the 1930s and 40s, there was significant discrimination in certain fields, and that shaped what kinds of professions Jews could enter and then what kind of careers they could pursue in that context. As those barriers disappeared in the late 20th century, Jews really spread out into a wide range of professional pursuits. In 2007, a community study was done in the Portland area that suggested that upwards of 80% of the Jewish community had at least a college education, and upwards of 40% had graduate level degrees, which suggests that a significant number of those Jews were working as lawyers, doctors, educators, and the like. You have to go to anecdotal evidence to get much more specific than that. But I would say on the anecdotal front that there are plenty of Jews in Maine who are not in the stereotypical fields. One completely idiosyncratic and thoroughly Maine example, there was a lovely essay written a few years back by a Jewish lobsterman who just loved being out on his boat. And the same is true for Jewish back to the landers. Quite a significant number moved to Maine in the 1960s and 70s, and in many ways rediscovered their Jewish roots by connecting to the land here in Maine. And one of the things that's characteristic of Maine's Jewish life today is a significant interest in environmentalism, in ecological activity, much easier to get a minyan for a prayer hike than it is for a traditional synagogue service in most communities in the state.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because it's a very similar narrative, it sounds like, in some ways to other places that we've heard about. And it's interesting that you mentioned the junk or recycling dealers, because in Wisconsin, a great deal of that talk in Midwestern was about Jews in that area. So it's interesting that that was in Maine also. There's a question here, sort of, and as a follow-up, you mentioned that there's many non-wealthy Jews in Maine, and given that so many have gone on to higher degrees and higher education, is there something else that drove that difference? Why the community is non-wealthy?
Sure. So first of all, on the subject of junk dealers, Waterville, Maine, which is the community I know best, in the early 1900s, 5 out of 6 of the local junk dealers were Jewish. So absolutely, that was a nationwide phenomenon outside of the major metros. There are several reasons for Jews not being as affluent in small communities. In some cases, it's a reflection of the fact that not all jobs are the same, even within a single profession. So lawyers in Waterville, Maine, make a lot less money than lawyers in Boston or New York. And not only that, lawyers who practice certain kinds of law make less money than others. And so there are members of Waterville's Jewish community and other Jewish communities who practice law and whose families qualify for free and reduced lunch. That is a reality that we often overlook. There are also plenty of Jews who do not pursue higher education or who do not pursue careers that pay especially well. Frankly, educators in the state of Maine don't make very much money, and so that becomes an issue. So the correlation between higher education and affluence is not as direct as many people assume. It's also important to recognize that there is a strong correlation between geography and affluence. Wealth is increasingly concentrated in specific metropolitan areas in this country. Portland, Maine is one such community, but the rest of Maine most certainly is not. And so that level of poverty affects everybody in the community, although certainly it affects some people more directly than others. Let me add one other dimension to the way in which both poverty and diversity contribute to Jewish life in Maine today. I mentioned that there are a significant number of non-Jews who are attracted to what the Jewish community has to offer, right? In some cases, that's simply a matter of showing up at the Maine Jewish Film Festival's events. In some cases, it results in conversion. Conversion is one of the leading growth engines of many of Maine's Jewish communities. And the people who are converting to Judaism have the same economic and educational profile as everybody else within the community. And so we have Jewish members of the community who are experiencing those same class dimensions, right? A lot of times we assume when we talk about Jews that we're talking about Ashkenazic Jews. There are plenty of Jews who don't trace their ancestry to that story of the Jewish immigrants who become peddlers, who become shopkeepers, whose kids go on for college education, whose grandkids become doctors and lawyers and teachers.
Thank you. Yeah, and on that note, there's a few questions about denominations, like how large is the Reform versus conservative versus Orthodox communities. I'd be interested in hearing, you mentioned conversion. What which denomination are people in Maine drawn to? And as an additional question, there's somebody asked about whether or not there's Israelis who have moved out of some of the big cities in the Northeast to Maine also.
Israelis are everywhere, including in Maine. And as a result, we have much better Israeli food now than we used to when I got here 15 years ago. The question about denominations is an interesting one. It assumes that denominations matter. Outside of major metros, they often don't. Where denominations are useful is as a convenient brand label. I know I was in Washington, D.C. just a few months ago, and I knew which synagogue would be most likely to meet my personal needs by looking at the label and saying, oh, okay, I'm a conservative Jew. That's a conservative synagogue. That's the one I want to be at. Great. But when you're in a community that only has one synagogue, you actually don't want to label yourself in that way because you can't afford to exclude anybody. And in fact, even to the extent that synagogues do have legacy denominational labels, those labels don't actually reflect what's going on the ground. Waterville's synagogue happens to be conservative. Augusta's synagogue, 20 minutes down the road, happens to be Reform. One of those synagogues is home to a thriving Talmud study group. It's the Reform synagogue, not the conservative one. Both of those synagogues have a nearly 100% intermarriage rate within their Hebrew schools. Both of those synagogues have the same demographics. They have somewhat different styles of prayer, but frankly, it's the conservative synagogue that has the richer tradition of prayer hikes rather than inside the synagogue services. It really comes down to local idiosyncrasies. It comes down to the nature of the individuals who are leading those communities. And one of the things that we've been able to do in Maine is cultivate a kind of win-win atmosphere in which congregations and their rabbis partner with one another for mutual benefit rather than compete. The rabbis in Augusta and in Waterville will regularly refer people from their own towns to the other synagogue if they think for whatever reason that the other synagogue might be a better fit for them. And by now, those rabbis have trained their boards to recognize that this is not a matter of losing people. It's a matter of helping people find their right place within the community. And those synagogues partner together in any number of ways. The one place where denominations might be relevant in the small town landscape is Orthodoxy. Modern Orthodoxy is not designed for small town Jewish life. In the old country, there were plenty of traditionally observant Jews who lived in very small communities. Today, the kinds of amenities that Orthodox Jews are looking for simply don't exist, even in a place like Portland, Maine, much less a smaller community like Waterville, Maine. There are a handful of individuals who self-identify as Orthodox. And of course, Chabad, which is committed to serving Jews everywhere, has established quite a number of communities here in Maine and across the country. Frankly, as a personally liberal Jew, one of the things that I'm really troubled by is that if current trends continue, the only rabbis who will be serving many small communities will be Chabad, because Chabad is committed to serving Jews wherever they might be. And for a wide range of reasons, many liberal rabbis, cantors, communal professionals, others who are committed to thriving Jewish life are not making that same personal commitment. One of the things we're trying to do at the center is encourage people to think about the benefits of participating in and serving small communities, and then providing those people with the training, mentorship, and peer support they need to thrive in those spaces, to overcome the challenges and really to seize the opportunities.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it sounds like a really wonderful project to that you and the other rabbis, Rabbi Isaacs and the others in Maine are doing. So, and I appreciate the idea of the denominations, kind of like a community center of all, coming together rather than the focus on the denominations themselves. There's a number of questions on the relationship between the Jewish community and other communities and how Jews are viewed, such as whether or not there's been a rise in anti-Semitism in Maine, like there has been in other parts of the country, and other, and whether how Jews, if Jews are considered others, or they're really part of the community. If you want to say more about that.
Sure. There's certainly a rise in anti-Semitism. We are definitely seeing it. It's not as problematic as in some other places. What we see across the country is that anti-Semitism tends to be directed at Jews who are visibly identifiable as Jewish, which tends to correlate with Orthodox Jews, which tends to correlate with major metros, as I said before. And so in that sense, Maine is escaping some of the anti-Semitic trends. Of course, another set of anti-Semitic trends, quite different in nature, is the anti-Israel sentiment that can sometimes skew into anti-Semitism on college campuses. Some campuses in Maine are experiencing problematic dynamics when it comes to anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiments on campus. Colby College, fortunately, is not. Happy to speak to anybody who wants to consider Jewish life and learning. Colby is one of the best liberal arts colleges in the country for that purpose. And one of the reasons why, and this is true not only for Colby, but also for many of the Jewish communities across the state of Maine, is that we make a point of cultivating relationships with our neighbors. In Waterville, Maine, I mentioned briefly Senator George Mitchell. He belonged to Waterville's Lebanese Jewish community. The Lebanese community arrived in Waterville at about the same time as the Eastern European Jewish community. Both were ethnic and religious minorities in a town dominated by Protestants on the one hand and Irish on the other, and then those Francos on the third. And there were tremendous tensions between those three groups. And the Lebanese and the Jews banded together to stay under the radar and to support one another. And one of the beautiful illustrations of that, when the synagogue built a new building in the 1950s, the Lebanese Youth Association donated the water fountain. And there was a plaque in the synagogue about the Lebanese Jewish connection. And that kind of relationship has continued across the decades, and now extends just beyond those particular minority communities. One of the things about being a small town rabbi is that you're not the rabbi of a congregation. You are the rabbi of the entire community, Jews and non-Jews alike. The rabbi is a major player in civic and social affairs, in the fabric of the community. And because everybody knows one another and everybody works together to achieve common goals, when issues arise, when there's an anti-Semitic incident in town, for example, community leaders will band together and provide support to one another. This is something that we've actually seen play out in some of the other communities that we are supporting the Center for Small Town Jewish Life. There was an anti-Semitic incident in one of those communities, and we counseled the rabbi and lay leaders there to really use this as an opportunity to deepen ties with allies. And that has actually helped to stem the tide of further anti-Semitism in that community. There are strategies that can work. And in that sense, we often say in Maine, in this and many other ways, we're not simply on the edge, we are actually on the cutting edge. What is happening here is increasingly going to be happening across the country in any number of ways. And that includes not only some of the challenges that Jews have faced over the years, but also some of the solutions.
Thank you. There's a few questions here as follow-up about the colleges in Maine. And there's a few, so I'll just go one at a time. But starting with the historical one, when did some of the colleges do away with the Jewish quotas?
So quotas became forbidden under New York state law in 1948, in federal law in the 1960s. I don't have direct data on when Maine's liberal arts colleges dropped their restrictions. Bowdoin never officially announced that they had restrictions. It was just pretty obvious. And in fact, they published their enrollments by religious affiliation every year for the implicit purpose of showing how few Jews were there. Bates, to its credit, not only documented what it was doing and why it was doing it, beautiful document justifying why they need to restrict Jews, why they need to restrict women, all sorts of things that they really thought this through. They were reflecting 1920s values. But then what they did as a college in the 80s and 90s is publicly unearth this material and express, this is what we did. And here's why our values today do not match those values in the past. And here's what we are doing now to create a more diverse, a more inclusive community. Colby always had a higher number of Jewish students. By the 1950s and 60s, increased access to to social life as well. But there was still anecdotal evidence of anti-Semitic discrimination into the 1960s, and even a feeling of marginalization that students reported into the 1980s. The person who endowed my chair in Jewish studies did so because he was a proud Colby alum, and his daughter was struggling as a Colby student by a feeling of marginalization. What is it that we can do as a college to better serve our Jewish students, to better attract other Jews as prospective students? His solution was to establish a Jewish studies program, now department, and over the years, that has actually proven to be an extraordinarily wise investment on his part.
Thank you. That leads perfectly into some of the other questions. One was obviously yourself at Colby College, so maybe you can speak to other universities in the state, but how many Jewish staff and have been hired at the universities, and sort of where they stand as sort of person used the word rank, but and then just a couple other questions. I'll say them and I can repeat if you need me to, but there's questions about whether or not the Jewish organizations at different universities have a relationship with each other, and students belonging to Hillel in those organizations. You want to speak?
Sure.
To this? Yeah.
Yeah. So I should make clear, I haven't mentioned it yet, but the University of Maine was certainly the largest institution in terms of the number of Jews who attended it during the 19-teens, 20s, and even into the 50s and 60s. It's quite possible that the University of Maine continues to educate more Jews than any of the liberal arts colleges simply because of the sheer size of the university. I don't know very much about the University of Maine, either its main campus or its variety of additional campuses. When it comes to Colby, Bates, and Bowdoin, Colby is by far the strongest in terms of Jewish life and learning. There are, in fact, thanks to the Center for Small Town Jewish Life, 4 rabbis on the Colby payroll. That is unheard of. And a number of those rabbis play an active role as instructional faculty. And so students have the opportunity to take courses, to participate in informal Jewish life. In fact, we do hybrid work. We just launched this year what we call the Jewish Ideas Lab, which meets every other week. And students, whether they're enrolled or not, come together for Beit Midrash style learning. And students from diverse backgrounds and perspectives are talking about questions that matter to them. And that kind of environment is incredibly productive for fostering a sense of comfort and safety and inclusion, not only for Jewish students, but for students of a wide range of backgrounds who are looking for a community, who are looking for intellectual and social opportunities that they don't find elsewhere. And the same is true for students at Bates and Bowdoin who are connected to what we do at Colby through the Center for Small Town Jewish Life. We host a fall Shabbaton that brings students from all three campuses together on a regular basis, and we provide support to the Jewish student organizations on those campuses as well. That's much more of an informal, indirect support. Each of those campuses has its own Jewish student organization. One of them most certainly is not formally a Hillel. I don't think the second one may or may not be. Colby is affiliated with Hillel International.
Thank you. And as a final question about colleges, do Jewish children who I guess goes both ways? Do Jewish children who go to college out of state I think you mentioned before many are leaving, but how many return, and do any Colby graduates stay in Maine?
There's certainly a mix. Back in the 1930s and 40s, it was common, especially for Jewish women who grew up in Maine, to go to college in the Boston area. The goal was quite explicitly to get their MRS, not necessarily their BA. And what happened in that time is you went where your husband went. And so men from Maine who married women from elsewhere brought their wives back to Maine. The women ended up leaving the state. Their kids in the 1960s and 70s uniformly left, and then a small percentage came back. We're now seeing an increased interest in life in Maine among millennials. That includes Colby students, Bates Bowdoin, UMaine. There are plenty of folks who discover the opportunities that Maine has and try to stay with it. My kids insist that they're never leaving the state. I don't believe that, to be perfectly honest. I think they're going to disappear, but maybe they'll find their way back. We'll see what happens. There's certainly a lot that we have to offer. And as somebody who grew up in Philadelphia and has spent time in Boston and New York, there's also a tremendous amount that we don't have that other parts of the country have, say nothing of all the parts of the country I haven't personally experienced. And one of the things that is, I think, to the benefits of those who pursue higher education is that it really does afford opportunities for mobility. It means that people can find the place that works for them. And I'm thrilled that many people have discovered that Maine meets their needs. And I'm perfectly comfortable with the fact that it won't meet everybody's needs, and including the people who grew up here sometimes.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes left. I want to just ask a more broad question, and you can kind of say what interests you most in it. But there's a number of questions ranging from the availability of kosher food to whether or not there's a mikvah. So more broadly than some of those questions, I wonder if you just want to speak to Jewish life and practice or ritual in Maine, and any sort of thoughts you want to bring it together at the end here.
Sure. Yeah, when my wife and I moved here 15 years ago, we assumed we'd be going down to Boston on a regular basis, if nothing else, to buy kosher food. It turns out we haven't needed to. The supermarkets here in Portland, at least the largest ones, carry the basics of kosher food, kosher meats. So we're certainly fine in that regard. You can get kosher chicken in a variety of communities across the state. Others will come down to Portland for beef, for example. And there are still some who will go down to Boston for certain cuts of meat. We certainly don't have the kind of kosher stores, kosher restaurants, kosher anything in that sense, that you'll find in major metros. Mikvah is an interesting story. Portland was home to a mikvah for many years. It was part of the modern Orthodox synagogue when that synagogue moved out of that area that I showed on the red-lined map into one of the more suburban neighborhoods in town. They put a mikveh in their backyard, but as that synagogue declined in membership and in energy, the mikveh fell into disrepair and was ultimately shut down. There is still a functioning mikveh in Bangor, Maine, that is run by the community. Chabad in Portland now has its own mikveh. And later this year, there will be the grand opening of the first new mikveh in the state of Maine. The conservative synagogue in Waterville, I mentioned that conversion is a major growth engine for the Jewish community. And as a conservative synagogue, the rabbi believes that, well, we're going to be converting Jews. We need to have access to a mikveh. And that mikveh has to be accessible to everyone. It can't be limited by Chabad or other Orthodox standards. But the mikveh needs to be done to the highest standards. And so, as part of a capital campaign that was just concluded, construction is now underway on a thorough synagogue renovation to include a brand new mikveh. And there are already plans underway for once the ice freezes in the nearby lake to go out with one of the local pickup trucks and carve out a block of ice and put it in the bore in the mikveh, and that will be the source of Mayim Chayim, of the living water that mikveh is using. And we're all really excited by the ways in which traditional Jewish practices continue to find a home in the non-traditional spaces of small town Maine.
That's an amazing story. There's with 1 minute left, there's a final question that I think is fascinating, and it's just what is the how has the pandemic affected sort of small town Jewish life in some of these synagogues and communities, and have things changed? How have things changed over the past few years?
The pandemic has made Jewish life much more accessible. The ability to Zoom into synagogue services, to Torah study, to any form of Jewish life that you can imagine. And so Jews in small towns have really embraced this as an opportunity. And there are a number of synagogues in major metros. I'm thinking of several of the ones in New York City, but there are plenty of others as well that have really developed extraordinarily high quality Zoom-based programs. And even as we've returned to a post-pandemic normal and synagogue life is resuming in person, there are plenty of people who are taking advantage of what Zoom has to offer. Because in fact, challenges of geography were real even before the pandemic. There are Jews in Maine who live 2 hours from the nearest synagogue, some of whom are driving 2 hours to get to services, but are appreciating the opportunity not to do so all the time when they can Zoom in instead. Here's the catch. We all know, and anybody who spent way too much time on Zoom during the pandemic experienced it, that Zoom is not a replacement for community. That there needs to be opportunities for engagements, for 360 degrees, for people being physically proximate with one another. Zoom is a great asset to small town Jewish life, but it can't be the sole model. It can't be the only way that Jews are connecting with one another. And the challenge right now and the opportunity right now is, how do we strengthen in-person Jewish life in tandem with what is now increasingly available online?
Yes, thank you. I think that that's a great point to end on. That's the question that we ask ourselves here at the Haberman Institute. Also, the opportunity to speak to you in Maine is amazing, and maybe one day we'll be able to have you down here in person for a talk in the DC area or somewhere else. So thank you. And there's a number of questions from you all that are about specific cities and camps and things. And as Rabbi Freidenreich mentioned, it sounds like he's willing to answer your questions. So we're happy to pass those along, or if you want to reach out directly to him.
So what I would say is, first, check out the web.colby.edu/Jews in Maine website. Second, another website that's worth considering is mainejews.org. If you're looking for a specific camp, for example, mainejews.org, which is the website of Documenting Maine Jewry, has a tremendous amount of information. So if you're looking for very specific things about family members or locations or the like, check out those first. I am more than happy to respond to questions by email about broader things or specific issues that you're trying to find on those websites and having trouble with. I can't claim expertise in every single community, certainly not every single camp.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and we'll include those web addresses on our follow-up email. So thank you again for such an engaging lecture, and it was truly fascinating, all the narratives, and it's wonderful to hear about your work in small town Jewish life. So thank you again, and thank you all also out there for joining us. We look forward to seeing you all again soon.